welcome everybody to this book talk. I think maybe the first book talk that we've done for Salata. And we're very excited to have you here, but also very excited to have Akshat Rathi here, author of the new book, Climate Capitalism. For those of you who don't know the Salata Institute, I just thought I'd start there. So the Salata Institute, which is across the whole university, has roots here in the Kennedy School, and this is part of our space. And the mission of the Salata Institute is to develop and promote durable, effective, and equitable solutions to climate change challenges confronting humanity. So it's a solution-oriented group, and therefore it's completely fitting that our guest today has written a book about climate solutions. So we're actually going to stick to our knitting here and talk about solutions. And we're here in this new space, but we're here with Akshat, who is the host of Zero, a climate podcast for Bloomberg Green. He has a DPhil, I'll say it the right way, you said PhD, but it's really DPhil in organic chemistry from the University of Oxford, a Bachelor in Technology in Chemical Engineering from the Institute of Chemical Technology in Mumbai, worked for Quartz and The Economist, worked widely read in global publications, and it's produced this book, Climate Capitalism. And as I was telling Akshat, and I think this is a testimony, I read this book not once but twice in the last couple of weeks, and I strongly recommend it. It's a set of 10 sets of case studies, maybe a few more than 10, that look at all sorts of solutions in the climate space. And it draws, if I may, on your background, the description of science here, coming from a scientist, is really very good. You know, it is accessible, it's clear, but as far as I can tell, it's also very well, kind of tied to the science. So we have a scientist here who's actually able to write about science. But at the same time, this is a story about people and about, how it is that people in leadership positions take decisions. And obviously the journalistic element comes out very strongly here because there's a people element, there's a technology element, and the third element that we'll hear about is policy. And it's all packaged in this really accessible and readable book with a particular point of view, which is that there's this combination of things that can solve, at least help to solve, the issues that we face in climate. So in the next hour, we're going to spend time in conversation, but to give you your assignment, at a certain point, I'm going to open it up to your questions. So be thinking about questions that you'd like to ask. Because, as much as I have more than an hour's worth of questions, yours are probably going to be better. So good afternoon, Akshat. Welcome here to Harvard.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for that lovely introduction.
It's true.
I don't even need to tell people about the book anymore. You've explained what it is about.
I don't think so. But maybe we can, there's a kind of an origin story for everything.
Yeah.
And so maybe you can talk about the origin story for how it is that this book came to be.
Yeah, I mean, as a journalist, I'd never written a book, so I wanted to pick up a challenge. So that's the origin of the idea that, maybe I would like to write a book. But I also didn't want to just write a book because there are plenty of books in the world, and there are plenty of climate books in the world, and I wanted to try and tell something that would add and maybe change perceptions. And the biggest gap I saw in perceptions when I pitched the book was that there was a sense that, the Paris Agreement has been signed finally, the emissions are still rising, really companies aren't changing, so governments aren't taking seriously, they put out these goals but don't really do anything about it. We're doomed. That if this is the best we can get, it's not working. And then on the other hand, as a reporter, I'm seeing all these solutions actually starting to work in different places around the world, right? In India and China, which are typically blamed as the sort of coal burning countries that are going to toast our climate goals. And so I felt like there was a need to try and bridge that gap. I mean, I do that from journalism, but it felt to me having a book which had a clear thesis but backed by real stories of change, of solutions working at scale, all around the world, would be a worthwhile addition to the literature.
And it indeed is. I mean, and to the point you made at the outset, recent data would suggest that 52% people around the planet are actually fairly pessimistic about our ability to find a solution, and only 25 are hopeful. I wouldn't say optimistic, but hopeful.
Yeah.
And I think you give evidence for both the 25 and the 52 that there's things to be done. Now, beyond the stories and the technology, there's a thesis here about something that you call climate capitalism.
Yeah.
Can you help us understand that kind of overall thesis
Yeah.
that will then give us an ability to dive into the specific case studies
Yeah.
and understand them in context.
So maybe best place to start is that people tend to put whatever they don't like into the bucket of capitalism. So let's just define what I mean by capitalism, which is a very narrow definition of an economic system that has profits as a driving force, and private ownership, because only then can you benefit from the profits, but always operating in service of society. Capitalism doesn't operate in vacuum. It is a fiction. Markets are a fiction we create so that we want services as a people. Now, capitalism is also not one thing. You run them differently in different political contexts, and we can talk about those different political contexts. But what's happened is, at the most macro level of economics, we've been not pricing in the impacts of all the profits that are being made, and all the services that we gain. So we want those services, but we've not priced in the impacts, the negative impacts that come from either carbon emissions or other emissions. We're finally starting to do that. And that's only one way in which we're starting to address it. But that fundamental imbalance has to be probably never be corrected, but at least addressed. And climate capitalism shows that you can start to do that. It doesn't have to come through carbon pricing, can come through a different set of policies, but governments have to find their powers to try and get capitalism to operate for service in society for climate solutions, because that, despite what people might be pessimistic about, people do want a solution to tackling climate change, and you start to see where that's happening through the book.
Okay, so important role for policy, and we'll get to some of the case studies and see how that works.
Yeah.
And clearly an important role for technology too.
Yes.
And people are the third element of this. Okay, so everybody, people, a little three-way triangle here, we'll get through most of the book if we can just keep that in mind. Now you have, for those of you who haven't read the book, there's the bureaucrat, the winner, the doer, the fixer, the billionaire, the wrangler, the reformer, the enforcer, the campaigner, the capitalist. 10 different archetypes of types of activity that you would categorize under climate capitalism. You can actually, they're different, and I know there's no hierarchy of one's more important than another, but could you pick one of them, kind of tell a little bit about the story, and then explain how that's an example of climate capitalism?
Yeah.
Wherever you want. There's lots in the book to go.
Yeah. Okay. So maybe let's start with the first character, the story of a science minister, the story of a bureaucrat, and why a bureaucrat is also a climate capitalist, which is the story of Wang Gang. He's born in China. He trained as an auto engineer, got a scholarship from the World Bank to go and study in Germany, got a PhD in auto engineering, got a job in Audi, rose up through the ranks, became the head of production in Audi. But all the while he's watching developments back home in his country, and he's realizing, look, there's just no way my people are going to be able to live the kind of lifestyle that Germans do, burning 16 barrels of oil per person per year, when Chinese at the time in 2000 were burning 1. It'll be choking the cities with pollution. It'll be an import bill that the country can't afford. And so, at that time, China was trying to up its game in the automobile industry. It's been trying to do that for a while, but it really was getting to a point where it was a badge of shame for how poor the Chinese auto industry was. And so you had a number of bureaucrats visiting China, visiting Germany, visiting him in Audi, to try and figure out how to make better cars. And he said, look, you don't want to make better automobiles, better internal combustion engines, because that technology is topping out, and here are all these problems. How about we work on a different technology solution altogether? And those technologies exist, but they need to be scaled up, and we can manufacture things in China. Let's go and do that. And so he's given this secret program, and over a 8-year period, he comes up with electric buses and cars for the 2008 Beijing Olympics. And of course, all his predictions about air pollution going up and the import bill going up came true. And so the government is like, okay, you showed us that you could do something. How about you do it for the entire country? And so he's made the science minister, and he's told to create an entire industry for manufacturing electric cars and batteries. And he does it through, what we call industrial policy. And industrial policy is not something China invented. It's been around for a long time.
Sure.
America has used industrial policy, often. But it was applied to the Chinese context, where the government gave a bunch of subsidies to companies to try and create more electric cars, but it also had sticks. If you were in Shanghai or in different provinces had different sticks, you had to enter a lottery system to get your fossil fuel car, but you could just turn up and buy your electric car. And that combination of carrots and sticks is what eventually now we know is the largest maker of electric cars, the largest maker of electric car batteries, BYD, the company that now is bigger than Tesla, CATL, which now makes batteries in the heart of German auto industry. And so you get the forces of people, Van Gang, coming up with policies and unleashing the potential of a technology.
But where's the capitalism part?
So none of this could have happened without private industry, private investments, right? So the Chinese government put in, at least in how we can measure direct and indirect investments, subsidies, to about $60 billion US. The amount of private money that came in was 5 or more times more, including Warren Buffett, who is now the largest shareholder of BYD. And also, it was created in a space where even if it was policy that was driving the market itself was competitive. At one point there were 450 EV car makers. Now there are fewer than 100. So there's been a ton of consolidation. Lots of investors have lost money. People who made bad bets have lost money. And so, that's the idea, that if capitalism has any good properties, those are that it can use its profit motive to create solutions and have that competition being driven to find what solutions work best. But it has to start with policy, at least in this case, because you need to create a new market that didn't exist.
So, this is a theme throughout the book. The policy seems to be an igniter of businesses, whether that's Orsted or whether that's Stuff and Breakthrough. Policy is starting things, but ultimately you're seeing capitalism is picking up once they've initiated.
Yes, most of the time. How do you fix large companies? That's a
We'll get to that because you have some really interesting case studies about ExxonMobil and Unilever.
Yeah. So for new solutions that we need that policy needs to start. But for existing solutions and how to clean them up, it's perhaps a different order.
In fact, there's this quote that you have in the book, if I get it right, which is something for us all to remember. It says, "Since the time of Henry Ford, no automobile industry in the world has ever become internationally competitive without some kind of government intervention."
Yeah.
And so I guess we just see another example of that.
Yeah.
And Tesla, I think, received some government intervention
So
too.
much. Multiple times. So it got a loan from the Loan Programs Office just after the financial crisis. It could have gone bankrupt had it not got the loan. Its first profitable quarter was only profitable because it was getting money from the California zero emissions vehicle mandate, where other auto companies were paying Tesla because there was a certain amount of electric cars they had to sell, and if they didn't sell that, they had to buy a credit from Tesla, and that's what made Tesla profitable when it turned profitable in its first quarter.
Another one of your case studies, and a competing book, by the way, is Bill Gates's book and work, although he probably has a bigger bank account than you do, and started Breakthrough Energy with $1 billion plus with some of his closest friends. And Breakthrough Energy is certainly, and you can tell the story for people who don't know it, an important force in the climate space. But is this really climate capitalism, climate philanthropy, or something else?
Yeah. Well, Breakthrough Energy Ventures, the story is, maybe a step back. So Bill Gates, for all the money he has, is also very good at using his dollar to bring in a ton more government dollars for his causes. Yeah. So after he, stepped down from Microsoft, or at least moved away from an active role into doing philanthropy full time with Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, he was able to pick a cause, have it backed by science for why it needs to be a cause that's important and government should pay attention to, seed it with small amounts of capital, well, still $1 billion or so, but seed those ideas with institutions, with research, with academia, to make the case for it, and then get all this government money. Typically, sometimes the ratios were 1 to 20. For $1 billion he put in, $20 came from governments toward causes like trying to deal with tuberculosis or HIV, AIDS, or to deal with vaccines and distribution of vaccines. So he learned how to use capital, his capital, to drive towards government money towards causes. With climate, he realized the problem is much bigger, that as much as he could get that multiplier from government, this is now these are trillion-dollar problems now, and that's only going to come from private capital. So with Breakthrough Energy Ventures, he first made the bet that the solutions that we deploy can actually make more money. These are services that governments should want, companies should want, people should want. But it is going to require time for those solutions to actually become profitable. So when he created Breakthrough Energy Ventures, he created with a different kind of mindset from a typical venture-backed fund. A typical venture-backed fund would look at making an investment and then a return within 5 years, and it would be a software company like Facebook or whatever. But with Breakthrough Energy Ventures, he said, climate requires more time. The solutions are harder, and creation of new markets is driven by regulations most of the time. So let us take a more patient approach to it. And now that's being copied many times over. No longer true, but at one point in 2021, there was $1 billion venture firm launching almost every other week. And so that having that mold of how you can actually use private capital but use it in a thoughtful and a different way for a climate challenge is the story of Breakthrough.
So if part of the story of Breakthrough is patience and long horizon for investments, then how do you scale that into capital markets that don't have that kind of horizon?
Well, capital markets have been actually quite good at figuring out where the growth is. Tesla, for its valuation even now, which is down quite a bit, is at that valuation because markets bet that this company has a lot of growth in front of it. Of course, there are other problems and other factors like Elon Musk that boost the stock market. But growth, markets know how to invest in growth. So there is, you're trying to balance the short term versus the long term, but that's not the only dimension that markets need to care about. They also need to care about companies that are growing and companies that need to die. And markets can also differentiate between those two. And so you can make, with climate tech, the case for patience, because eventually the market will be so large. And some investors get that and some investors don't. And enough investors get it that you have hundreds of billions of dollars going into climate companies.
But in the last 12 to 18 months, the amount of investment going into climate tech has
gone
down considerably. How do you explain that, given that the problems that we face haven't gone down?
I mean, it's a more nuanced answer in that, in general, venture capital funding has come from people who have money that they would like higher returns for than they could get in other investments. With high interest rates, they are getting a decent enough return from the bond market that they don't have to really go into the high risk territory. So one thing that's happened is venture capital funding in general has declined over the past 2 years quite significantly. Within that though, climate tech has actually declined less. So a greater proportion of venture capital funding now every year has become more and more climate oriented, which is an interesting trend. But the second thing is that it's also, investment goes through hype cycles, and climate tech in 2021 was probably in a hype cycle. And so a lot of companies that probably, in a rational world should not be funded got funded, and now you're getting a reevaluation of there's less money available, so what are the companies we should invest in? Not a bad thing. You get correction in the market, and that's happening right now. And then the third thing that's happening is now, Breakthrough Energy Ventures is about 10 years old as a concept, is about 7 years old from its first investment. And so you're getting to a place where companies are starting to scale up. And so you need different type of capital going into those companies. Venture capital is good for the first 4, 5, 6 years of a company's life. After that, you want bigger amounts of capital coming in. And that is actually happening. So private equity is going into growth capital mode. Not enough, but many companies, so like the H2 Green Steel, which is a Swedish startup last year, raised more money than many of the AI startups that we think of, darling AI startups like OpenAI or Anthropic. It was probably third in that list of companies. It raised $6.5 billion in 1 year.
But if I remember that's basically using the same model from Northvolt.
Yes, so it's
which is a combination of offtake agreements,
Correct.
but strong government guarantees.
Correct. Yes.
So how replicable is that?
Not always, but the fact that it's been replicated twice in 2 different industries is interesting. And you only need the first of a kind to show that might happen. So it's a model that could be used to show how to tweak the system so that you can actually make it work for what is a hard solution.
So these are inspiring stories, but there's another narrative, a narrative about businesses that have a halting, reactive, sometimes counterproductive approach to climate. And in your chapter, one of your chapters, a sub-story is about something called GCC.
Yeah.
Which can be either, and our colleague Naomi Orestes has kind of studied related things here. So maybe you for those people who don't know that part of the story, maybe explain what that was all about.
Yeah.
And is that just a historical accident, or are we still seeing that?
Yeah, so the story of GCC is the story of the Global Carbon Council. I might get my dates wrong, but I think it was created in 1989. And this is like a year after a famous testimony from Jim Hansen, a climate scientist in the Senate, warning about how bad climate change could be. And it was created with an express, it evolved, but with an express desire to slow down climate action through regulations that may come in the form of government regulation that would, and the GCC was made up of money from oil companies, coal companies, utilities, and it worked really well because they exploited a media ecosystem where they paid for advertorials that looked like editorials but were paid for. They paid a bunch of spokespeople to go and sow doubt about science. Journalism has this rule of being objective, hear both sides, even though one side might be 99% right and the other side 1% right, but you give them equal footing in a story, and that was exploited really well to sow doubt, and it worked because we didn't get a strong climate regulation coming in. We didn't have a global agreement till the Paris Agreement. Now, that is the problem with capitalism, which is if you have a profit-driven motive, and that motive is very powerful, you can use it to corrupt the system so that governments and people in government do your bidding rather than the bidding of people, because that's what they're really hired or really elected to do. And so that tendency has to be brought in control. And I think one of that's down to us, right? We live in democracies where we should be able to differentiate between leaders that are doing the right thing and leaders that aren't. Has that gone away? Not completely. We don't have climate denialism today, but we have something called climate delayism, where I don't know if it's the same cast of characters, because the utility industry actually is now seeing how renewables could be a better play for them. So, but there are similar cast of characters who are now using their motives to cast doubt about solutions. Electric cars are not clean, heat pumps don't work, and all that. And so, in a way, we got the Paris Agreement despite the GCC, and the only hope you have is you're still going to get climate solutions at scale despite the climate delayism.
And I think the most recent data is, if you look at anti-climate lobbying relative to climate lobbying, it's about 2 to 1, and the top lobbyists against climate are the Southern Company and ExxonMobil.
Yeah,
we'll get to ExxonMobil in a bit, and I think it manifests itself For example, just a few months ago, there was this interesting bill that was introduced in the New Hampshire state legislature. I don't know if anybody followed it. And it would make it a felony to use ESG criteria in trying to evaluate investments for state investments, a felony. Now, it was one of the many that didn't get passed.
Yeah.
But is that an inherent part of climate capitalism, and how do we deal with that?
Yeah.
I mean, is it, because some could argue
Yeah.
that is endemic to.
Yeah, I mean, you should also answer the same question yourself, because you've studied this more closely than I have. But what we have in trying to fix a system that is so large is we don't know how to fix it. We don't have one answer on how to fix, say, investing, sustainable investing. We want to fix it. We want to move away from the investing that was causing emissions to an investing that does not cause emissions. How we do that, we don't have an answer for. Markets are good at taking ideas and telling you what works and what doesn't work, but because we don't always allow for that market of ideas to actually play out, sometimes you get the sort of political backlash on woke ESG politics, that as we are running that experiment and we are in that messy place where we are trying to figure out what is ESG, how does it work, how can we actually, already there's backlash and there's push to not even allowing us to run that experiment to find what will be a solution that could work. So trying to solve a complex problem, you have to deal with at least have the freedom to actually try out different ideas, and that currently isn't happening, at least in ESG.
Right.
It's certainly happening in climate technologies, but I'm sure there's a brigade that's trying to figure out how to stop that from happening too.
Yep. One of the case studies that you present in the book is the story of Paul Pullman and Unilever. Again, for people who don't know, maybe you can tell that story, and then I'll ask you to kind of take the story up to the current time, where the second CEO since Pullman is in place, Schumacher, I think is his name, and Pullman. Well, let's just get the story out, and then we'll look at the postscript.
Yeah. So this is going back to the starting point where typically policy ignites the climate solution space. It's not always true for large companies. For large companies that already produce things and have a particular business model, they need to find ways to make emissions and non-financial metrics accountable within existing frameworks. So ESG is part of that, but sometimes you also need leadership from companies on how to do it. So Unilever's story is interesting. Paul Pullman comes in and he makes the case that we are in a fast-moving consumer goods business. If we want to differentiate ourselves, we need to find a way to create a desire for our products that would be different from others' products. And one thing we could really do is think about climate change and the problems that climate change is bringing, and how we can reduce the carbon impact of our goods so that we can create a differentiator in the market, so you'll have both doing good for the planet and producing more profits because people want that. But he also knew going in that capitalism is run on the short run, and you have to produce these financial projections every quarter, and if I try to change the business model a little bit, we're going to lose a little bit of our profits for a while. So he goes ahead and he suspends the quarterly financial projection to making it twice a year, and makes the case to the shareholders: you've just made me CEO. I'll be here for a while. Give me some time, and I can show you that this thing can actually produce better returns. And so he starts to do that. He puts out a climate plan, which is the first for a large corporation to put out a climate plan as early as it did. Carbon accounting had barely just taken off as an idea, and very soon he's hit with a takeover bid, what is known as hostile takeover. So they tried to take over in other ways, it didn't succeed, and so they said, now we're just going to convince the shareholders to let us take the company. And he goes to the shareholders and says to them, look, my plan is starting to work now. Yes, their case might be right that I'm leaving some value on the table right now, but in the long run you'll get more value out of it. The shareholders supported him, he survives. That's sort of the good story of how Unilever played out. Now, what has happened since, because Paul Pullman left 3 years ago now, 4 years ago,
2019, I think.
5 years ago now. And there have been 2 CEOs since. And this is where leadership matters. This is where having the ability to communicate matters. And yet, what is true, so what's happened to Unilever is that its profitability has gone down, and not because of climate. There have been some strategic mistakes made around, trying to take over companies that, the bids went wrong, etc. So those strategic mistakes aren't related to climate. So there is criticism around, are you still a woke company trying to do green things, leaving profits on the table? Unilever doesn't think it is. So in March, they put out a new climate plan. It's the 3rd climate plan that they've put out, and the targets are still all there. If anything, they're getting just more refined in how they're going to meet them. So they still think climate change is a risk that they need to deal with, because their supply chain is smallholder farmers who are being affected by all kinds of extreme weather impacts. And they think that climate impacts will also affect the bottom line for the products they sell. So, for example, Paul Pullman told me about heat waves, and he said, like, we make ice cream, we should be able to sell tons more ice cream during heat waves. And we used to, and now we don't. And that's because the heat waves are getting so extreme that people stay at home and we don't buy enough ice cream. And so you get these double impacts on the bottom line. And Unilever still is betting that a climate solution is needed for the company.
It's a slightly nuanced bet now.
Yes.
Because Schumacher is saying, if I read him correctly, well, we need as opposed to it being a high-level strategy, it needs to be a business-level strategy. As opposed to long-term impacts, I need to see short-term impacts. Instead of doing everything in every business line, we need to do a few things in a few business lines. But still a more positive story.
Yes, but also, I mean, it's sort of going through the experiment. At least the experiment is being run.
Yeah.
You had 100 things you were trying to do, and now you're going to do fewer things that you think are working, which is not a bad place.
Yeah, not a bad place at all. So we are at about 20-ish minutes, so I want to open it up to you. I've got plenty more questions, but I want to give you an opportunity to ask our guests questions. So if you could just introduce yourself, please.
Sure. Thank you. I'm Jenny Stevens. I'm a Climate Justice Fellow here at Radcliffe Salata. And from a climate justice perspective, climate change is a symptom of a deeper economic system that is extractive and exploitative.
Yeah.
And the number one thing that we need to be focusing on is fossil fuel phase out. And that arguably, again, from a climate justice perspective and a global perspective, that is the solution that we need to focus on, because and it's not just about climate, so many other reasons, right? We need to be doing that.
Yeah.
So my question is, how do you reconcile that with these examples of, it sounds like entrepreneurial activity, when we're actually going in the wrong direction, including ExxonMobil CEO 2 weeks ago saying, oh, we're not doing an energy transition, we're just doubling down on fossil fuels, and they have no plans to stop, and it's just getting worse and worse every single year. So,
it is a very interesting question. I can answer it in 3 different ways. So one is that I grew up in India, right, the country that suffered through colonialism from the Brits for 200 years, and that injustice can never be corrected, right? If Britain agreed to pay reparations to India, Britain doesn't have the money to pay India the amount they took out of it, right? So we start from an unjust place. We just have to acknowledge that. The second thing is, I'm trying, as a reporter, my goal is, I'm not an activist, my goal is to see the world as it is and to find places where things are working and take a pragmatic approach out of it, right? Capitalism, for all its flaws that we've talked about, also has benefits, right? I grew up in India where my grandfather worked in a factory, my father got an education because my grandfather could send him to school. He was able to start a business, send me to a school abroad, and here I am sitting in Harvard talking to you, right? That kind of growth is that, we can have a philosophical debate about whether that level of growth, that pace of growth should ever have been allowed on planet Earth. Sure. But that level of growth is possible. Countries have experienced it here, and now countries in developing countries are experiencing it. From a moral perspective, shouldn't all countries get to experience that? What climate change is doing is, because of the impacts that are coming, you're getting reversal of these progress metrics. So what is the way out? You want as much fairness in the system as possible, but you also have a deadline within which you need to meet these climate goals. So to me, as I look at the world around, when I look at academic work that's been done around degrowth, around donut economics, there are ideas that could work. But what I'm seeing working is different from the ideas that are being talked about, which is not to say these ideas cannot work, but I'm trying to find what is working. And that is why climate capitalism to me is the way to make the solution work, at least while we have the time to address the problem, which is the next few decades. So no, it's not a perfect solution. It's imperfect. All solutions are imperfect. All climate solutions are imperfect. Your electric cars aren't a perfect solution. You'd much rather have more public transport. You'd much rather have fewer cars, period. But it's not always possible. I'll give you a number to guess. How many miles do you think Netherlands travels on bicycle? The Dutch travel on bicycles as a total number of miles traveled in the country. Guess.
A lot.
Guess.
In what, like a year?
Out of 100%, how many miles are traveled on bicycles?
Oh, like 90-ish?
90? 9%.
Only?
9%. Everything else you require cars for. So if the highest bar that you can reach right now with all the systems in place is 9% on bicycles, you can't have a world without cars. So what's the practical outcome that you want? What's the practical solution that you can make work? So I deeply understand the injustice that has been created, but you also want a solution, and so that's the practical outcome of climate capitalism.
Yes, thank you for the question.
Hi, I'm Anastasia. I'm a graduate student in sustainability at the Extension School. I was curious to hear more about pricing and for externalities. So I heard that carbon might not be the best solution. Could you talk about some other better solutions that you've seen?
No, I didn't mean carbon pricing wouldn't be a good solution. I'm just saying that carbon pricing doesn't always work as you would want it to. So one sort of like very high level economist point of view would be price carbon globally. You'll have people not buying polluting things, they'll buy cleaner things, and we'll slowly move towards a clean solution. The trouble is, even if that economic theory is right, and there's actually still debate on whether you can actually price carbon right, because there's so much uncertainty. But say that the economic theory right, the politics of carbon pricing is very hard. So you live here in America and there isn't a federal carbon price because there's divided politics on climate. But in Europe there is a European emissions trading system that gives a price, and it's not on all industries, but it's increasingly on most industries. And so the politics decides what kind of feasible outcome you get. In Canada, your northern neighbor, there is a carbon price, and it's a very interesting carbon price. They charge the polluters, and then they collect that money and give it back to the people. So 8 out of 10 families get more money from the carbon fee than they pay in the higher cost to the goods that they buy. So there are many ways in which you can do carbon pricing. That's explicit carbon pricing. Then there's implicit carbon pricing, which is applicable here in the US. So the Inflation Reduction Act is subsidies to make something cheaper, and that is actually an implicit carbon price. Sometimes it's kind of extraordinary. I think the early tax credits that were given to solar was something like $1,000 a ton for the avoided emissions for the solutions that were deployed. So economists would say that's an inefficient way of using money, but it is the politically feasible one.
Yes.
My name's Adam, and I'm in the business school. One thing that I've heard is that a lot of the climate solutions is that like a lot of the technologies that we need are like already developed to get us most of the way. Wind, solar, and really we should be focusing on like deploying technology rather than like investing in new things. So like one example that comes to mind is like fusion that Breakthrough Ventures is investing in, right? Like that might not come online until like 2050, 2060. So do you think like we need like more entrepreneurs bringing like new technologies, or do we need more people focusing on like scaling and deploying existing technologies?
So I mean, most is a good word. The last number I think I saw in the International Energy Agency, which is probably the only place that does it, they found like 65% of all technologies we need are there, 35% still aren't there. So things like long duration energy storage, which is the ability to store electricity in some form for month or season, like 6 months. We just don't have anything that is as cheap and easy to affordable. We have hydro power, so pumped hydro, where you take water, you put it up a hill and then store it, but that is a very geographically limited solution. You need many more technology solutions for long duration energy storage. So that kind of, there are a number of technologies we still don't have at scale and cheap enough to work. So you definitely need more investments in early stage technologies. The second thing that is beautiful about technologies is that you get more options to solve the same problem, and that is a good thing. You want more options to solve the problem. Now, you can fight about what is the optimal number of options you want and what is the optimal sum you spend to try and find those options. Those are worth debating. What is pretty clear is that having more options is a good thing, and so that's what happens with early stage investments. Sometimes you get these wild bets that people make because people are motivated to solve a problem, or people are motivated to make a profit, and those wild bets can sometimes turn out to be true. So that's another reason why early stage deployment, early stage technology investment is still useful. But you're right, the majority of the problem that needs to be solved can be solved, majority, right? Most of the technologies are there and you just need to deploy them, and you need different kind of innovation to deploy them. Like in India, electric two-wheelers are taking off and they are using battery swapping technology. So really cool innovation, works for that particular economic setting, might work in other countries like Nigeria. So you get innovation that is not technology innovation but deployment innovation. That is also needed.
Hi, thanks so much for being here. My name is Gunther Klenk. I'm a climate fellow at HBS at the moment. And I wanted to ask you about what your reading is of the speed of growth in especially the high growth countries versus the speed of decarbonization. So, example, you have a steel manufacturer in India. It decarbonizes, so the CO2 intensity per unit of steel produced is going down, but absolute emissions are still rising.
Yeah.
So what's your reading globally of your faring here in terms of the speed of decarbonization and what would possibly have to be done to accelerate it?
Yeah, I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but we are certainly globally growing economies faster, even as emissions are not falling, but the sort of dollar per CO2 is growing. So you get more dollar for every ton of CO2 emissions. So economic growth is starting to decarbonize, but it has to decarbonize much faster for us to be able to reach net zero targets. And the way you do it is through the sort of people, policy, and technology, bring them together. If that is what society wants, which is we want to decarbonize quickly, while we want all these other benefits or other desires of economic growth and industrial development, then you have to deploy these solutions that are initially more expensive, but then become cheaper the more you deploy them. Yeah. So I don't know if I answered that question.
We've got 3 here, so why don't we start here and then we'll just go across this way.
Hello, thank you for the talk. My name is Heel. I work in sustainability finance in Amazon. I was listening to your podcast on CCC and with Chris Stark,
Yeah.
I remember. And you mentioned that you attended the Climate Assembly in UK.
Yes.
Can you talk about
Of course, yeah. So the CCC is the Climate Change Committee. It's a very interesting, unique body now, not unique anymore because it's been copied, but it was created as part of the UK's Climate Act, and it was created as a watchdog and an advisory body. So it's independent, funded by the government, but it looks at what is the science, how to meet them, and gives the government carbon budgets and gives advice on here are the policies that you can use to meet those budgets. So Chris Stark has been in that position, the CEO, for 6 years. He's stepping down later this month. And in one of the questions we talked about, how do you bring people along for the transition? Because there will be changes in how we live, in what we buy, in perhaps the price of things, because they might go up for a while. And one solution is that you do something called a climate assembly. And it's been, again, done in a few countries where you basically have, and it was really fascinating exercise, I think it was about 100 people, and there were a few people who were observers, like academics and journalists, who didn't participate, just observed. And it was split over multiple days, but the day I attended, you had like experts coming in, talking about climate science, talking about climate solutions. It's sort of an educated experience. Then they went into workshops and they tried to answer questions about, what do you think about this? What do you think about that? And at the start and at the end, they asked people about what they thought about something and whether they changed their mind about what they thought before the assembly started. And he basically found that more people actually want climate solutions, even if they were initially resistant, because they got informed on the science. So a particular example he picks up is a guy who sort of libertarian bent, really just cared about national security, cared a lot about nuclear, and thought that climate goals are actually coming in the way of doing what is core to his worldview. And afterwards he was like, actually, if nuclear is part of the solution and can be made to be a part of the solution, and of course if renewables will bring energy security, then I'm for it. And so you get this change of mind. People don't change their mind that often, but through this concentrated experience, that was one way you could do, which you could do it.
And I think you.
Hi, I'm Eugen. I'm an undergrad at the college. Thanks for coming. I'm sure as a journalist that you think very thoughtfully about how your writing and your work fits into a broader context and like the narratives that it's portraying. And I think there's really good solutions that are coming out of private capital. I'm going into investing out of college, but there's also like a more nuanced take that's emerging in this conversation, which is that you acknowledge the imperfections of these solutions, the role of government, as well as the harms of economic growth on climate.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering what the motivation was behind writing this book and calling it Climate Capitalism.
Yeah. Well, I didn't choose the title. The publisher chose the title, which
There's another book with the same title.
There are multiple. I found out later. Yes. Actually, one of them is written by Hunter Lovins, and so I mean, it's an idea that's not new. The title I had, which probably wouldn't have sold copies, is the existential economy. How do you build something that allows humans to not just exist but thrive? And I mean, the goal of the book was to try and figure out how do you, economic growth brings benefits. It has its problems, but if in the past people have benefited from economic growth, in the future, can we still have that kind of benefit? It's not tied to growth. The benefit is on human well-being. The benefit is on being able to unlock human potential, being able to live fuller lives, right? If you are poor, you don't live fuller lives. That's the world we live in currently. So economic growth allows you to have a chance to live a fuller life. It is a way to an outcome. The outcome is, at least as I see it, better lives, more human development. What I could see is that you have a system that can be fixed, and we are seeing ways in which you can fix it. And because we are on a deadline, that is probably the best way that we can get to an answer. I'm not saying it is the only way. All other solutions that you think are valid can be used, but what works is what I wanted to try and answer.
Right. I think there was one more. Yes, please.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Herman. I'm a PhD student here at the Kennedy School. So it seems to me that a bit of the overarching theme of many of these stories is, on the one side, having markets and private money, and then being enabled by policymaking and the public sector. But then my question is, what kind of lessons can policymakers derive from this that are more nuanced than just private money in markets and then the public sector trying to enhance it? How can we add some nuance to that? And do you think it's just that straightforward? What can you say about that?
No, I mean, that's why there's a book with 70,000 words in it. It is more nuanced. It really depends on the place where you want policy and what kind of policy would work. And not all markets are easy to create. So, you take electricity markets, for example. They don't fit in the classical capitalistic framework. You don't want two grids which will compete against each other and tell you which is the cheaper one. You want one grid. Same thing with roads, same things with pipeline, water pipeline network. And so they're not classical capitalistic instruments where you can have competition. You need something that is closer to a regulated monopoly. If it is privatized at all, it can be state-owned. You have a different set of solutions for that kind of system. Whereas you get a much more classical capitalistic answer for electric cars, where you have a bunch of companies that, you tell them this is the kind of product you need to make, but I'm not going to tell you what is the product. You can find your own that you think you can convince people to buy, but we are going to define the market. And so you get a different kind of private market instrument that is involved. So no, it is more nuanced, obviously. And it depends on the type of product and type of market that you want for a decarbonized solution.
Maybe if I can, because we have a few more minutes,
Yeah.
maybe I can go back to the thesis of the book. So these three elements in terms of technology, more and better technology, I think that's not a bad thing.
Yeah.
In terms of policy, smarter, more targeted policies that actually will move things forward. But the third element is
Yeah.
people.
Yeah.
And so, coming from a business school where leadership is considered something that we need to study and enhance, what are the people lessons that come out of this book and all the reporting that you're doing?
It's interesting what is commonly tied. I suppose what commonly ties them all together is that they understand the science. I feel like almost all characters have a decent understanding of climate change, and I think it is sad, but it is true. I don't think the gravity of what climate change is and is going to do to the world has quite sunk into the public populace. But when it sinks in, and I've seen this happen multiple times, even outside the book, so many people that I know, every president of a COP meeting, for example, typically is a government bureaucrat and almost always becomes a convert because they realize how big a problem they are trying to solve and what kind of impact that could have if they did actually manage to move the ball. So that, I think, was a commonality between them, that they understand the positive impact it can have on humans, on society, on the future, if we get it right. And that allows them, and they're all, they're making irrational bets to some extent, right? Breakthrough Energy Ventures are making an irrational bet on whether climate tech companies can actually come to fruition and be profitable. Paul Pullman's making an irrational bet whether large companies can actually turn around and do good for the planet and make profits. And so I think that motivation to want to try and solve a problem gives them the drive to be able to go behind what might seem like an irrational solution, but is a needed solution.
So the science tells them why they need to do something. The irrationality gives them the hubris to believe they can.
Yeah.
But what allows them to actually affect change? Because everybody in this book has affected change somehow.
Yeah, it's what does, the other thing that happens, and it's consistent, which I don't talk about because we talk about the leaders here, but the leaders are only leaders because they get people to follow. So the International Energy Agency, which we didn't talk about as well, you need a reform of how international institutions work. International Energy Agency was born out of the oil crisis, was created for a very clear mandate about how rich countries can secure enough access to cheap oil reliably. That was its mandate for the first 30 years. And then gas became a fuel and climate change became a reality. And the very governments that wanted energy security and access to oil also signed up to all these climate goals. So the institution had to change. But it wasn't a government bureaucrat, instead it was an economist who makes that change happen. And of course, he's not alone. This is true, I'm sure, if you've worked in companies or in government, young people especially understand this problem at a level that older generations typically don't and want to be a part of the solution. So you get almost instantaneously, if there's a leadership position, more people agree with it and allow for that leadership position to flourish. And so it is a give and take. Leadership isn't I say so you do. You learn from where there is potential and what people want and channel it to be able to drive towards an outcome. And ideally, as much as it might be irrational, an outcome that actually affects change. And it's messy, but that's why there are chairs in leadership. That's why there's academic work in leadership, because nobody knows what the secret sauce is.
Fair. And I think that's a great place to end for our hour. I mean, on the one hand, we need to know about science. So here at the Salata Institute and Harvard, we have got great scientists who are doing groundbreaking work. We need to, I wouldn't call them irrational bets. I think it's about hopeful bets, about things that, you know, at least there's a margin of probability that says these can work, and a willingness to take some risk, and third, the ability to accept change. I think that's what you've taught us here in the book Climate Capitalism, and we're all wiser because of the book and because of the hour that we spent with you. So
Thank you
very much.
Thank you.